What a journey.
Dude, isn't this music great?
Not only is it great, but I'm uplifted.
Let's go. I was like trying to think. I was like, what is elevator music, but isn't like what can I type in that's elevator music, but it's not elevator music?
Is this Zelda or something?
Pokemon, brother.
Oh, Pokemon, got it. I wasn't allowed to play Pokemon, dude. When I was a kid, Pokemon was satanic.
What,
Yeah, dude, Pokemon was like literally of Satan. Like
bro?
it was like Satan was like creating demons, training demons, and then he was like creating Pokemon. That was like his third agenda, and like the Christian household was like that. That's
Wow,
what Satan was up to.
wow, 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 wow. That is wild. Big, big sad. Guys, we're gonna start here in just a minute. Here, I'm gonna wait for some of these speakers to pop in here. We'll get into this conversation. Enjoy the Pokemon music. Oh, Charlie, do you mind messaging the Stacks slash Alex people that we just started? I
Alex
will
is
help.
gonna make it. They're in Hong Kong right now, but Sack
Got
should be
it.
here.
All right. I'm going to follow up on the people for the spaces. I don't think these actually went out. I'm just noticing that.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So it's
Wait, no,
CMP
no,
is the
no,
other
no,
one.
no, no, nope. They did. They did. Nope, nope, no, they didn't. But they did follow up earlier. Let me shoot them a message. No, yeah, it did not go through. That's super sad. No problem.
You're making me crazy. What's up, dude?
There he is. All right, I'm going to shoot him a speaker invite. Here we go. We've been vibing out to Pokemon music, and we have no shame at all in vibing out to Pokemon music. It's been great. Yeah, you making me crazy. I just sent you a speaker invite. We're waiting on. I think we had a little issue on the back end stuff, so we're waiting on the rest of the people to show up. But super excited to talk about all the Bitcoin stuff going on and the things that you're working on as well. Charles has been familiarizing himself with all of Bitcoin in the last few months. The dude is bleeding Bitcoins. He's actually rich in Bitcoin knowledge. And so that's what I'll say for Charles's life. Mine has been a little bit as deep, but nowhere near.
Well, I think what's been interesting is like each layer. I don't know how it's been for you, but like each layer that it seems like I get into BTC. Yo, what's up, English? Each layer I get into BTC, it seems like the depth gets even deeper of really understanding what's going on. And I guess I'm interested. I don't know if anybody on the panel knows this, but like the difference between a UTXO and a Satoshi, because it seems like they're one and the same, but at the same time, like I don't understand what like an unspent UTXO is compared to a single Satoshi, because aren't those kind of the same thing when you have a UTXO and that is just attributed to a single Satoshi? Does anybody know this?
English. I'm gonna throw that one over to you, brother. Maybe you know
What,
the answer
what,
to
what was
that.
the question?
Yeah, so like okay, so how deep are you into runes ordinals right now? I can't imagine you any deeper English. I mean, you've got to
I mean,
be.
I'm pretty well versed. I mean, I think there's a lot of people that know more like from the technology aspect, but from like a consumer product standpoint, I'm pretty well versed. But I'm happy to try to chime in wherever I can.
Yeah, so basically, and you can bring up you making me crazy, Cade, or chains. It's brick chains. I don't know exactly.
Bro, I'm trying. I sent them.
Oh,
I sent
okay,
them an invite.
okay.
I'm
I'm
waiting
sorry.
on them. No, I'm just kidding. No, but I am. But
Okay,
I am waiting. I did send an invite to you. You're making me crazy. So let me know if you get that. No Spaces has been rugging. It's possible you're literally on stage, and I just don't know. I just can't trust this platform anymore.
it says he's up here. What's up? You making me crazy? How are you, man?
What's going on? Better than last space we had. I'm not in agonizing pain this time. How are you two doing today?
You good? You were doing agonizing pain. I couldn't even tell.
I like to hide my pain. I push it down and use it as fuel to just work with.
That's what I did with bad relationships for years, dude. I mean, the success I had a good 5 year run there where it was just like pure and just.
Did Charlie just rug for anybody else?
Yeah, he rugged.
Dang, Charles, not like this, bro. Not like
Okay,
this.
sorry.
Oh, he's back.
Sorry, I got a call. No, I got a call. No, this is kind of my point. So I've been diving into like the runes ordinals, and I always have like a tech side desire to really understand like the underlying protocol, especially because I think that this conversation is a little bit interesting because you kind of run up against the BTC maxis, and there's definitely some headwinds. Wait 1 second. Man, I need this guy to stop calling me. There's definitely some headwinds that you're facing whenever you're having the conversation. Um, Yo, what's up? Sax is here. Cool beans. And everybody, if you guys can retweet the space, we meant to send all the invites out. We had a blurb on the internals, so the invites out for the speakers didn't get sent. That's why the space is so small. That was our bad. If everybody can retweet the space, that would be great. We'll get it bigger and kind of build this thing slowly as we go. So, but no, I think that there's something interesting, and I don't know English. You've like doing literally like ordinal spaces every single day. I guess I'm curious too, like what the conversation is looking like, BTC Maxi, to ordinals, and like, is there a lot of friction there?
Well, I don't know. Like, you mean friction between the two camps?
Yeah, I mean, one's
Yeah,
spears, one's knives.
I mean, I think anything that's not Bitcoin for like transactional purposes is going to have like cause like some kind of friction. And so I think from like I guess quote BTC Maxi perspective, like everything is basically that's not like holding Bitcoin like from whatever other like source of income you have and buying and holding it. Everything else is just a scam to like get more Bitcoin out of you. And it's like their joke is if I can take this Bitcoin away from you, it's probably better off with me than you, right? So like to them, anything that's intrinsically ordinals or fungible tokens on Bitcoin that involves a meta protocol, which you have to buy into, like believing that meta protocol is just a scam. So like even somebody buying like the epic Satoshi, the first one that was mined during the halvening, you have to buy in that into ordinal theory, and that means that there's a sequence of Satoshis based on first in, first out, um, and that Satoshi has a collector's value. But at the end of the day, the market tells you whether it has value. Like you can believe that or not. I mean, maybe a 1930s teddy bear made by some famous, I don't know, teddy bear maker that died in the 1920s is worth $1 million to like 10 people on earth, and that's really just enough for it to have that collector's value. Like you could think it's worthless because it's just a piece of cotton and wool or whatever, but there is a market for it. So if they choose not to believe in it, like that's fine, but the market is literally telling you otherwise. And so, yeah, there's friction in that standpoint, but I think it's probably important to understand what runes are intrinsically, and maybe kind of giving some adoption to like just these types of either collectibles or like meta protocols on Bitcoin itself. It's important to know that like Counterparty had fungibles and non-fungibles, and that was sort of like adopted and had like its own niche type of thing, but that was really before like Ethereum NFTs, and really that it blew up in a significant way with like EVM and all this other stuff. And so now you have a culture of people that will speculate on meme coins, non-utility coins, actual utility coins, and you have people that are JPEG enjoyers. So now with the advent of ordinals, the main significance is that you have people coming from Ethereum and Solana who want to enjoy the same culture, whether that's eventually DeFi, whether that's collecting JPEGs, whether that's speculating on memes and having fun on the timeline, that can do it on layer one Bitcoin. So I would say the biggest breakthrough of ordinals itself is more the adoption. So I can make a chain that's faster, more steady, has more parallelization than Solana. But at the end of the day, if there's only engineers that are enjoying this and there's no culture around it of market consumers that are, you know, consuming products on there, whether that's pure speculation, like that chain doesn't have that much value. So I would say the biggest win here is adoption. And what happened is in the very early days, Casey didn't really account for a system to have fungibles. It was really just meant for non-fungibles, and ordinals he believes were superior to NFTs on Ethereum or Solana, and that's why he created it. And but there was always a market intuitively for people who collected JPEGs, and Domo's the one who came up with a fungible system. But the downside to that is that it was on the ordinals protocol. So what that meant was you had to actually create an ordinal, a JPEG essentially, with JSON. And to trade this, you would have to literally create a new inscription, and then you'd have to destroy that inscription. And even if you wanted to delist it, you had to destroy that inscription and then create a new inscription. And as it sounds, this is a very just like cumbersome process for the consumer. It also clogs up the chain because there's tons of transactions that are not actually needed, and you have a ton of waste. And so other people came out with other protocols that for the most part weren't adopted, and either a lot of the times it was a very elegant solution, but it was kind of overtly complicated from an engineering standpoint, and wallets or marketplaces didn't really want to adopt it because it really was just it was too much. It was just too much of a heavy lift to incorporate this protocol without any proof of adoption. And so, really, the innovation of Runes is that all those protocols that were created afterwards that had no adoption were UTXO model based, which lets you interact with Bitcoin in a very native way. It's not interacting it on the Ordinals protocol, it's interacting with layer one Bitcoin. It's a separate meta protocol. And so what happens here is the biggest innovation of Runes is not so much the tech. He did simplify it a bit for like Magic Eden and Xverse and all these other platforms, Luminex, to support it. So he did maybe make it a little bit more efficient. But the real breakthrough is that you automatically convinced a whole cohort of consumers that this was the protocol we're going to move to. He announced Runes, and it really didn't launch for another 6 months. But the moment that Casey said, "Hey, I'm going to make a UTXO fungible protocol," everybody was already sold. So the big lift of like creating, like I'll use the analogy of making a new layer one chain. Like the biggest lift is not the technology. I think anybody can really like copy and paste someone else's technology, make it a little bit better here and there. The biggest lift is the marketing, the getting the adoption. And so that was already there. So I would say that like the evolution of fungible tokens goes from having something that has a lot of adoption but sucks, then having better protocols that are great but don't have any adoption. And now the next evolution is like we have a great protocol and great adoption. So what we're really looking forward to moving forward is to have some kind of change to either layer one Bitcoin, and that would be like OpCat or another operational code at the fundamental Bitcoin level, to change Bitcoin itself so we can have AMMs, DEXs, and liquidity pools. Or we have other layer two side chain solutions that will maybe not be 100% decentralized, but will be trustless enough for the majority of consumers to trade in a very like EVM Solana type way that people are used to. So that's a little background of Runes and kind of what they mean in the market today.
Wow, that was a mic drop. um, yeah, no, a couple of things that I thought were interesting. So, when I was doing like whenever I try to research a new protocol, I'll develop like a Chat GPT. I stick all the ordinals handbook that Casey wrote, and I'll stick it and have it like teach me. And I think there's definitely a case for both sides. Like one thing that's interesting is you kind of see this across the board, like with companies like Hedera and other ones that have like great tech. Even Hedera has oh man, I can't remember the it's like a licensing. It's basically like HIP 2022 or something. It basically means that they can have finality on a certain. Do you know what I'm talking about? You making me crazy?
No, I'm just saying Buddha, the H-Bar
You just
Foundation, and
you
Hedera all
just
together.
just thumbs. Oh, okay, cool. So just general thumbs down. Great. No, no. So no, they have like finality on their just on their transactions where they can go to banks and they can actually become a protocol that supports like banking structures and do that type of stuff. It's the same with XRP. It's also the same with Cardano. But a lot of times, what's so interesting is the retail adoption and the liquidity is not following the people who have heavy regulations. And this is kind of like I'm saying this on the back of what you were saying, English, because I think it was a really good point. You see with Magic Eden, okay, OpenSea, publicly traded, okay, huge company, all the money in the world, and they just sat back and they watched Blur undercut the market, and then Magic Eden use viral meme based marketing to take over the entire market and become like the biggest people within the ecosystem now, and by adopting new technologies, innovating with the space in addition to using meme marketing instead of saying hyper professional. And so I guess for me too, I think that the win condition, especially for and what's crazy too is I wouldn't think that Web3 would move like this is going to sound like a hot take, okay? But I wouldn't think that there's 50 million to 100 million dollars in daily liquidity or volume that's on Web3 crypto Twitter. I would think that it'd be necessarily like you'd have to go farther than just because it feels. Does Web3 crypto Twitter for you guys ever kind of feel small in compare? Like, I feel like I see a lot of the same people, and the spaces aren't huge. It's not like 10,000 people. It's not like a crazy amount or a number, but the liquidity that you're seeing coming through new protocols and innovating is absolutely insane. And so I'm surprised that the needle got moved for ordinals and runes so much off of. And this is without hyperbole, and I'd love to hear everybody's takes on this. But I honestly think if you look at ETH, there's no ETH NFT daily space, and if there was, I think there'd be more proliferation. But if you look at ordinals and runes inscriptions, you've got multiple people that are running multiple spaces and being like the center point. And even if you don't join the space, you look at the side of Twitter on the right side and you see the name ordinals, runes, and it's building this idea of constants in people's head. So no, I guess my thought is I think you hit it on the head, English. Like I think the adoption has happened and the change and move over has happened not because maybe the protocol is an absolute hook, line, and sinker. It's the best tech ever invented, but it just happened to proliferate. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's not a Ethereum focus like NFT space because there's no narrative to talk about. Like, so you have the narrative on Ethereum that a bunch of people got into like Ethereum very early. Maybe they made a ton of money like in the ICO days. Maybe they made a ton of money on like DeFi summer, and then all of a sudden you had NFTs and you didn't really know what the ceiling was. Like, it was like, okay, these are like digital country clubs. Maybe they can be expressions of IP. Maybe we can make a metaverse during like COVID and so everyone had like this headroom for speculation. And all of a sudden you have kind of not just the bear market, but like people going back from COVID and everything. So like everything's already been done. There's nothing new to like flesh out. Like, of course, with like the gamification of like incentivized like exploration of like L2s like Blast and stuff. And that's very kind of, has like the incentives and gambling, stuff, which is fun. And that's what they're doing. So that's why they're talking about it, because now they have some room for speculation. And that's just not true of layer one Bitcoin, because the thesis is like, okay, now that we've seen everything that's been done, what can we do here on Bitcoin? And it's really like the reverse, like the expression of of like the finality of like the Ethereum was like the NFTs. And I think people even think of cycles like that. Like, first, like the underlying asset, pumps, then meme coins pump, and then NFTs pump. Like, that's like what people believe because that's what we've seen. And because it started with JPEGs, and we really can't do DeFi in like a significant, like user friendly way on Bitcoin, people start thinking, okay, well, we don't really have the tools to do that. But now we have runes, we have the adoption, we have the UTXO model. Now, where does that take us in the future? So let's speculate on some of these like current non-utility, backslash meme coins, because that's just basically a bet on fungible tokens. and maybe we'll make some kind of really cool platforms, and maybe we'll have a stable coin. And so you have room for speculation. We had the non-utility PFPs. Maybe somebody will start coming up with like some utilitarian, maybe like game based assets. And so there's a lot of stuff that hasn't been done, and people want to see what can be done on Bitcoin. So that's why there is a narrative still, because we're essentially rolling back the clock to the 2020, 2021 era, just on layer one Bitcoin. You can't roll back that narrative. You just have a bunch of legacy NFT collections, some that are thriving, some not so much. And really, like, you haven't seen a new mint on Ethereum that has done well. And that's because it's pretty tough to say, hey, we're doing anything different. Like, people have already kind of like peeled back the curtains and know what an NFT project can do and what they can't do. And like, even founders to this day, like, or new people, they'd probably be more inclined to buy it, like an old collection that has a already established community, than minting a new project if they really think that there's some kind of business model there. And that's why you don't see the Ethereum spaces, because I think there's just not that much headroom for speculation. You've seen behind the curtain, you've seen the puppet show, and until something changes, it's kind of more of the same. That's what I think.
Yeah, I would probably echo that same thing right there. English. It's a pretty solid breakdown. Pretty cohesive breakdown there. Definitely want to see what. I see Shimmerton, co-founder of Ordinals Club, in here. I see Stackers Pool in here. Obviously, I see you making me crazy. Would love to pull you guys into the conversation. Shin, didn't know if you had any thoughts on that conversation in the Ordinals world.
Yo, hey guys. I mean, English summed it up perfectly, to be honest. I totally agree with him. I mean, English and I are pretty long in this space already on ETH and Ordinals now. And I think he described it perfectly while saying, if you know what's behind the puppet show, people will lose the hope and will lose the mystery. So without mystery, of course, the price hopium is going to be harder. So yeah, I totally agree with English points, to be honest.
Sure. You're making me crazy. Any thoughts on that world for the Ordinals? Didn't know if you're messing around in that world. I know the ETH NFTs. Yeah, I mean, Charles, for me,
I mean,
the NFTs. I saw the NFT. I mean, the NFT show with the Nifty. Those are probably the biggest example I had of like the Ethereum NFT daily show kind of thing. But they've kind of expanded to all sorts of things. But sorry, I saw you. I saw you start to talk. You're making me crazy.
I know you're good. So he did sum it up really good. I think the only thing I would add in is that it is just kind of a rotation of liquidity. So people that were on ETH when Ordinals came out kind of went over there, and then you had some other people who had been in Ordinals but not in the ETH community. It's just it is a small thing. Like we all think that there's tons and tons and tons of people that are doing all of this, whether it be DeFi, TradFi, SocialFi, whatever else you might throw in there. It's a small group of people relative to the population. So we're literally just moving around liquidity, and you can watch it like whenever ordinals and the coins on BTC or BRC20 start to go down, like you can see liquidity going back into the ETH side of the market or the Sol side of the market. Like it's all just moving funds around right now. Like we haven't got real new investors coming in at this point. Like we're still in that stage where everything's new and everything's scary to everybody else. So like mass adoption just hasn't happened.
But you know what I will say, like, that is underestimated? Like, it's like the whole narrative of like, well, there's not that much new money, so there can't be like, but you saw a ton of money go to ordinals. And the reason is because people were willing to use their money. People had the idea like, it's such a small circle, and that's true. And there's not new wallets, and that's true. But what people underestimated is how much money from the Ethereum ecosystem specifically. I'm not that familiar with the Solana, so I won't talk about it, but potentially even Solana, that people just weren't deploying. Like this motherfucker OSF threw like 1,000 ETH at like the at the blast bridge, like when it opened up. Like Bored Apes went from 150 ETH to like 30 ETH. I mean, I know they're lower now. Like, do you think it just like overnight went to there? No, there was a shitload of trading in between that, and people, sold and didn't fucking deploy anywhere else. So like, even though there was not new entrants, there was tons of capital. I know I wasn't buying anything new on Ethereum between June of 2000, or February of 2023 to like whatever till today. and people had their 5, 10, 100, 500, 1000 ETH on the sidelines. And once they had a reason to deploy capital somewhere, whether that was Solana meme coins, or and transitioning their ETH to Solana, or ordinal JPEGs, trust me, people had money. So like the whole narrative of like, oh, there's not enough money and we're just kind of shuffling it about like in a PvP, yeah, that's true. But there was tons of people that didn't have like locked liquidity in coins and JPEGs. They had that shit on in dry powder on the sidelines, and that's where we saw it from.
Oh yeah, and I'm not saying that like there's not dry powder out in this. I have some dry powder waiting for special occasions and stuff. I meant more like aside from those I shouldn't say few people, aside from the people that do have liquidity locked to the side, a lot of people wrote everything up and then wrote it right back down. Like there's a lot of Bored Ape holders, but you also have to think like take Bored Apes specifically, take Yuga specifically, for example, like that. The money didn't just go out. They didn't just lose their value. Value was extracted from the project in the way of airdrops all along the way. Like if you had a Bored Ape from the beginning, you got a mutant, you got a dog, you got ape coin, like you got all this stuff. So it's not like they lost that value. They just got that value in other things, and the floor price of the apes reflected that, right? So it's that was a perfect example of liquidity moving around. Like they got all the value of it, even if they held it from 150 ETH till now. Like they got many mutants, they got many dogs, they got a ton of ape token or ape coin. I'm sorry. So like the liquidity is there. It just got shuffled, and that's not always the case. But right now, it kind of is. I mean, in like I said, you can watch the chains. Like if you watch the tickers for the different charts and compare them in contrast to each other, like you can actually watch liquidity move from chain to chain to chain. It's really weird to watch, but
Wait, I would love to pose this
Yeah,
question to see to all the. Oh yeah, go ahead, Stackers, please.
sorry for cutting you guys. Really enjoying the space about runes and ordinals and it's. I just wanted to ask what are your thoughts about integrating runes to stacks and then on and the runes bridge, like building bridges for scalability and stuff.
The integration of runes and ordinals with what was the last part there? Sorry.
Integration of runes and ordinals to stacks, and like you think it's really something to do for scalability and building applications connected to stacks.
Well, and anybody can correct me if I'm wrong here. Okay, I'm just gonna I think I have a fairly good understanding on this. So like Stacks is pretty a little bit different in comparison to runes and ordinals. So runes and ordinals, it's more about like a software and tech companies that are wallets or whoever it may be in the future, supporting reading the BTC layer in the way that it needs to be read. So basically, sorry about the alarm in the background, but basically the runes and ordinals protocol works by putting code into places that typically don't have codes on a UTXO. So there's a thing called an op return on Bitcoin. Op return is usually, it has nothing inside there, but you're allowed 80 bytes of data. And what the protocol is doing is it's hiding arbitrary data inside those op returns. And so it's increasing the transaction size and then basically inscribing or putting on a UTXO some data. That data is read by a wallet or read by a protocol. And it's like, okay, so this UTXO or this single Satoshi has, this in the op return. So that means it's a rune like this, or it's an inscription like this. And basically, we're hiding like data elements inside of traditional Bitcoin transactions. And then there's like companies that are building stuff around reading those things on the Bitcoin transactions so that you have the readout. That's why English in the very beginning, he said something. He was like, either you believe in the provenance and you believe in the idea that it's inherently valuable, or you don't. It's not like this is like some crazy new thing that has like intrinsic value to it. It's like perceived, because it's still just a single Satoshi. At the end of the day, it'll have its same Bitcoin value, but ultimately, if you want to ascribe more value to it, that's like a belief system. So yeah, STX, I think a lot of the wallets are incorporating runes and ordinals. because it is like something built on top of Bitcoin. But the STX ecosystem in and of itself is a much more robust, built out, coded ecosystem kind of. Um, I wouldn't even say parallel running, because BTC, like ordinals and runes, is like almost not a layer two, really. It's kind of is, because you got to have software that's reading it, but in a lot of ways, it's still BTC layer one. Like you're putting it right into it.
Yeah, it's directly layer one. It's just a meta protocol on top of it. So it's not like you're running like a different chain like on it. So it's definitely nothing like Stacks. It's something that you run that that protocol on your node, on your client, and you can read that, in a way that you can. Essentially, there was two upgrades to Bitcoin, or one upgrade to Bitcoin, and then one meta protocol that allowed this. So the Taproot upgrade allowed to attach arbitrary data, and so that was like the significant change within Bitcoin that allowed for this. So before that, this wasn't possible. And then Casey came up with a numbering system. So now once you have the arbitrary data, 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 the arbitrary arbitrary that, the 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 arbitrary arbitrary that, the 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 arbitrary arbitrary that, the 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 arbitrary